With everything going on in the market over the last few weeks and the last few months, Solana has seen quite the pullback in price. But as of recently, it has been showing some phenomenal signs of maintaining its strength, and the bulls have been stepping in to say that they are back and trying to take over control. So in today's video, we're going to be going over 3 major signs and implications that say that Solana could see a very big explosion in price relatively soon, of course, if market conditions do allow. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's jump into the very first one. Now, the very first one is going to just simply be an accumulation of a few things, okay? Now, what I want to focus on is the technicals today, and then of course we can go into some on-chain analysis and just fundamental analysis going forward. But what we can see is just the nature of this retracement and the pullback in which we have been seeing over the last few months. Now, Solana has a tendency to see movements very similar to what we've been seeing recently, right? We've seen not only once and not only twice, but this is now the 3rd time in which we've seen that Solana will get extremely overextended and then enter into something of a descending / symmetrical triangle in order to really reaccumulate for the bulls to kind of slow down as they were getting exhausted, as the bears want to, get started thinking that they're having some success before we do see the bulls eventually back in control and continuing to push the price up. Now, of course, what we do have to pay attention to is the fact that as Solana's market cap does grow, these pushes to the upside are going to become smaller and smaller. As we do get bigger, it does get harder to get bigger. That's kind of just how that goes. So it is no surprise to see something of this nature in which we see that the price grew a little bit less here than it did here. And my expectation is that even if we do break out here, I think that move will be a little bit smaller here than it was here. And that's totally okay, and that's totally normal. As cryptos get bigger, again, we can start to expect a bit of diminishing returns from them. That's just the general rule for investing. But what we can see is that it has been a very similar setup and a very similar attempt to make a retracement in a very healthy way to what we have seen historically, which kind of rules out this being anything other than usual. Now, market conditions are a bit different than they were last year. That is something we do have to factor in. But the way Solana itself is handling it is very similar to what we have seen historically, and historically we have seen some pretty strong growth. Now, what we can see though is if we do look at this thing from more of a zoomed in perspective, still on the weekly charts here, as this thing has been falling and as we have been starting to really see the market take a beating over the last month or so, realistically Solana has been holding on quite well. As you can see, this $80 to $89 area has been maintaining very strongly, and that's a good sign. What that says is that as the market has been getting beat down, the bulls are starting to step in at some of these lower levels. And the reason that I believe that a big explosion in price could be happening pretty soon of up to 50% could be due to the fact that simply the bulls are becoming much more willing to step in, and they are very successfully slowing down the bears. Because realistically, in a bear market, what happens usually is this or this, in which we're starting to see the prices just getting tanked and tanked and tanked. And though we might see a little relief rally here and there, it just continues to get beat to the ground because realistically the bears are having much more success than the bulls. Hence, it's called a bear market. But what we can see is that as we hit some of these lower levels and as we do continue to retrace, well, realistically, Solana is seeing its bulls step in as they are still willing to be purchasing at these areas. And as we do see this continue to happen, what's going to happen is that the bears are going to weaken, their attempts are going to start to lose strength, and as that happens, then the bulls, it becomes much easier for them to take charge. If we look at something that is more of a technical indicator for item number two as to why I believe that the bull market could very well be back soon for Solana if market conditions do allow, is referring to that. And what that's going to be is the bullish divergences in which we are seeing here on the price. Now, what we can see is that as the price has been starting to work its way back down, its RSI has also been seeing a pretty strong reset. Now, let's go ahead and just get rid of this MACD for now. Now, what we can see is that we put in all of these lows back here in the summer low of 2021. And since then, we have very clearly been trying to put in this higher low. Well, in the same time frame in which we have put in what seems to be a higher low, if we do bounce soon, we have put in a very extreme macro lower low on the RSI. Now, what this says is that the bears have been successfully moving the momentum of Solana down. Their strength has been great. But in the same time frame and in the the moments in which they have been having all of this success in momentum, they have not been having that success on the price. And that although they have been returning these RSI levels back to some of their previous levels, they're not returning the price back down there. And that's because the bulls, although they might not be at full strength right now, they are strong enough to hold this price at some of these key levels of support to slow down the strength of that bearish move. And as this does happen, we start to see the RSI maybe slowly working its way down down to what's considered oversold, the strongest point in which the bears can get it to. And once we start to see that happen, usually from that point forward, we can start to see the bull step in, because realistically the bears are running out of steam. And so considering the fact that on just about all of our different RSIs, especially if you look at the daily, you can see that we are seeing this major macro, here we go, bullish divergence, in which we are putting in these lower lows and we are putting in these higher lows. One can go to say that the bears are starting to slow down and the bulls are very successfully starting to recapture the price step by step. Now, does this mean that it can't capitulate back down towards $50 first before this happens? No, it definitely can do so, especially with the fragile market in which we are in right now, which is controlled by Bitcoin. But it's the idea that it is going to very likely fall a lot less than, than what we've seen so far. I would go ahead and say that we are very likely more than halfway through this fall. Okay. Now, the very last reason in which I am under the belief in which we are going to see a pretty strong bounce for Solana relatively soon here is going to be what we are seeing happening on the MACD. Now, historically speaking, the MACD has worked very well in terms of gauging momentum. And this further backs up the point that the bulls are regaining control of the Solana price. As we can see is that on the weekly MACD, when we were getting this massive pullback to the downside, it was being reflected here, right? We saw this bearish cross happening. We saw this bearish divergence in which the blue line was working its way away from the orange line to the downside. And then that was kind of like the peak of how bad it was getting. We were just continuously falling from upwards of, let me kind of move myself out the way here, from upwards of, right up towards $250 all the way down towards $80. I mean, we were in a very bad full-fledged move to the downside. But what we can see is that momentum has slowly started to shift. And as it started to shift, and as those bearish divergences were starting to get canceled, and as those bullish divergences were starting to become much stronger, you can see that the MACD is reflecting it as we start to see our blue line beginning to converge with its orange line. Historically speaking, when we see these bullish crosses happening, in which we start to see the blue line work an upward slope back up through the bottom side of the orange line, if completed successfully, as we saw here, and as we saw back here as well, we have historically seen some pretty massive growth. And that is the track in which we are slowly getting on right now. You can see here that our pink bars are beginning to get printed. That's a sign that this bearish momentum is slowing down. And as we do start to enter back into bullish territory, if we can see a break to the upside here, boom, it may be a strong move back up towards 120, 130. That will very likely put us in a position to see this bullish cross happen on a macro MACD based perspective. And from there have historically been some historical gains to come from those moves. So as you can see, Solana is slowly putting itself on track to see those strong moves that we needed to. Many of our indicators have reset. Many of the things we need to reset have reset. You just simply look at the Bollinger Bands on a weekly based perspective. We are now interacting with the bottom side of our Bollinger Band envelope. This could be reason number 4, sure. What we see is that as we interact with the bottom side of this Bollinger Band envelope, it becomes extremely likely at some point that once we finish seeing these two standard deviations away from a moving average, that we will eventually resort back up towards that moving average. And at this point, if we do go back up to our moving average, I mean, that's $168. Because remember, when we measure our Bollinger Bands, again, they are 2 standard deviations away from that 20 simple moving average. But what happens historically is that once you start to interact with them, you can only see that interaction for a small limited piece of time before we will eventually resort back to that moving average there, right? So that's why I say, we could see that push back up towards 160, which is damn near 100% gain at this point, okay? So overall, many of the signs do point to say that the bottom is very soon for Solana. Whether it's now or whether it's in a few weeks or in a few months, if we do see a bit of a capitulation here and then we really do start to bottom out, maybe even on top of this previous macro high, I am not really all too concerned on where it's going to be, but when it's going to be. And in my opinion, if market conditions do allow and we see Bitcoin do something like move back above 45,000, I am under the belief that Solana is one of those cryptos that will lead that strong revolution and that strong pushback to the upside into the continuation of this bull market. So with that being said, that's kind of my thesis for what's going on with Solana right now. Many of our major indicators are pointing to some very bullish momentum possibly being on the way as we have been shifting into a new period for this bear market in which we are in right now. And so for that reason, definitely do stay tuned for some of our more daily updates on Solana as we zoom back into the micro and talk about the steps in which we need to get to and take to get to where we're going. So definitely do stay tuned for those simply by turning on the notifications when you do subscribe to the channel down below. And please don't forget to like this video so more people can see it. But with that being said, of course, I hope you guys have an absolutely amazing weekend, and I will see you all next time. Peace.